안녕하세요, 여러분. 김지윤입니다. 오늘 책 소개를 하면서 또 굉장히 중요한 분과 인터뷰를 하려고 합니다. 곧 노벨 경제학상을 받을 거다라는 얘기를 듣는 분이시죠. MIT 경제학과 교수이신 데런 아세모글루 교수와 인터뷰를 하려고 합니다. 국가는 왜 실패하는가? 제가 리뷰도 했었던 그 책으로도 아주 잘 알려져 있고요. 또 좁은 회랑도 있었죠. 이번에 새 책을 냈어요. 권력과 진보. 굉장히 심오한 책인 것 같은데 어떤 내용을 담고 있는지 데런 아세모글루 교수님과 인터뷰를 하도록 하겠습니다. You probably wouldn't remember me. I did my graduate studies at MIT and my advisors were Jim Snyder and Steve Anzalaba here.
Oh,
Probably more than 20 years ago, Jim actually dragged me to your seminar and you were presenting your, just about to publish the paper. The title was a Colonial Origin, the
yes.
comparative development.
It's been a while. My God.
So thank you very much for being with us today and congratulations. The Korean version of your new book, Power and Progress, Our 1,000-Year Struggle Over Technology and Prosperity. Well, it's quite a long book, but I just read like into 2 days. But, I thought the argument of the book is not something that we hear often from economists, because usually they have firm and strong belief that technology leads to the progress and also it brings the prosperity to the society and the humankind, but you have some different idea in this book. So I was wondering, first of all, is that the idea you always have been holding, or is something that changed your mind or your attitude towards that technology?
No, you summarized it very well, Jiyun. And absolutely, I think economists, just like tech entrepreneurs and many policymakers in the United States, are more techno-optimistic. There's a very good reason for that. The last 300 years have been very impressive in terms of the technological achievements. And they have also been remarkable in terms of improvements in health, improvements in living conditions. So it is impossible not to conclude that we owe our current levels of comfort and prosperity to technological developments. And I think that is the foundation of many economists' beliefs in this area. It's also the reason why I would have agreed with that perspective 20 years ago. Over time, however, my view has shifted to something that does not contradict that, but adds a very important piece of context to it. There is no necessity for technological progress to bring these types of benefits. It has not been automatic, but it has been the outcome of certain institutional and technological choices we have made. And when we haven't made those choices, in fact, even the Industrial Revolution led to pretty bad outcomes for the majority of the population. So in some sense, we have to hold two conflicting thoughts in our minds. One is that we have been beneficiaries of tremendous technological progress, but at the same time, there's nothing automatic about that benefit. And for the next wave of technologies, we could fail to benefit if we don't make the right choices.
Well, you have demonstrated some of the examples, actually a lot of examples throughout the history, like Eli Whitney's and Panopticon, Jeremy Bentham, and all those technological advancements. And we believe that it will benefit a lot of people, but it was actually the small segment of population who got the advantages out of it. So could you please elaborate a little bit, like one or two cases?
In some sense, the centerpiece of the optimistic read that somehow, almost automatically, technological progress is going to bring shared prosperity, meaning prosperity for many different segments of society, not just a small segment. That has to work through the labor market. Why? Because most of us earn our living in the labor market. So if the labor market didn't function, wages did not increase, it would be very, very difficult, almost impossible to create shared prosperity. So the question is, what are the forces that lead from technological advances to higher wages? The most important one is so ingrained in economic thinking that it doesn't even have a name. Simon and I call that the productivity bandwagon. Productivity increases, it creates a bandwagon whereby employers demand more labor because they are more productive, so they want to hire more employees. And that, through the labor market's regular functioning, raises wages. But what we point out, exactly like you summarized, is that this hasn't worked so well for many transformative technologies. Eli Whitney's cotton gin is very interesting because it completely revolutionized southern U.S. economy the growth of cotton. It was impossible before because the type of cotton that could be grown in the South couldn't be cleaned with existing gins. So it wasn't very profitable to grow cotton. Once you had this new cotton gin, there was a huge boom in harvesting cotton. And then ultimately it led to this big cotton plantations. And many, many people became fabulously wealthy and rich in the US South. So you would expect, if the productivity bandwagon functioned, the workers who actually produced cotton would also benefit. But in fact, they did not at all. They became much more heavily repressed. They moved into worse conditions in the deep Mississippi Delta and areas. And of course, there's a very good reason for that. The workers who were doing that were the enslaved Black workers. They were under coercion, and that coercion tightened when plantation owners and others wanted to extract more labor from them. So that's a very simple example. You see why the type of productivity bandwagon doesn't work, because one group is so much more powerful. That's the institutional basis of it. A second example is from the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. The textile machinery was critical for the early phase of the Industrial Revolution in Britain. It automated work, so it displaced spinners and then weavers, and those groups actually lost out in terms of their labor earnings, and their working conditions worsened because instead of having the putting out system where they had autonomy and skilled work, they were moved into very regimented, heavy 18-hour-a-day work in new weaving factories, for example. So again, you see now another aspect of it, whether it's just automation or contributing to greater worker productivity.
Well, you probably heard this kind of argument the 1,000 times. That is true that, all those things are happening again here as of now, like a globalization and inequality in the society as well. Well, we cannot deny the fact that most of the people around the globe are better off than their great-grandfathers. For example, like in Korea, the poor people in Korea as of now probably enjoying the higher standard of living than the Korean people on the average like 200 years ago. You don't have to go back that far, like 1 century ago. I don't know. There's some argument against your argument in the book that the people probably will say that still, it got much better off than before, right?
I think there are several aspects to this. First of all, if you take the Korean economy, of course, I'm no expert, but yes, it has done fabulously well. But to some degree, Korea exemplifies some of the things that we are calling for in terms of how technology's path and its institutional structure should be organized. In Korea, because of labor shortages, there's a lot more emphasis in not just automating work, but also making sure that workers are productive. And second, Korea has a strong labor movement compared to the United States, for example. But most importantly, I think the Korean example or the Chinese example are indeed a very important achievement of the second half of the 20th century. But they are about catch-up, meaning that China, before then South Korea, were economically not at the frontier. And they have grown because new technologies that had already spread in the first half of the 20th century started being adopted in these economies. But the question is whether that really requires very different type of technological emphasis that went on in the United States over the last 40 years, and whether it really requires very rapid globalization that led to deindustrialization in both the United States and other economies. And I think the answer is probably no. Even without the same pace of globalization, China would have managed to grow. Korea, of course, would have managed to grow. And in fact, Chinese growth itself could have been more equal had it not been so rapid and so much under the control of a repressive type of economic growth. So I think you have to look into the set of choices again, that we need to have these two conflicting ideas in our mind all the time. Workers can benefit and have benefited from technological progress, and consumers around the world can benefit and have benefited from globalization. But that doesn't mean that the uncontrolled version with very disruptive effects on manufacturing workforces, less skilled workers, was the only option for achieving these outcomes.
Yeah, I could see that you're concerned about that the new technologies like AI and brings a lot of prosperity and the future and the progress to the society overall. But it seems like all the benefits and advantages are going into a very small segment of population in a particular business circle, like in big tech companies, for example.
Absolutely. I mean, again, this is not a hypothetical. Simon and I identified the problems that we are living in right now in the 1980s. But the companies that, became the forerunners of technological breakthroughs in the 1980s were minor relative to Google, Microsoft, Amazon, Facebook today. These corporations have become so large, and we saw that already in 2000 and 2010s. They are introducing new products, but then most of the benefits are being captured by a very small group of shareholders and managers in these corporations. Number of employees Google has is still minuscule relative to sort of company like General Motors or General Electric used to have. So they are not creating labor demand, and they're capturing a lot of the surplus that new technology creates for their small group of shareholders.
But it's because of the companies like this that the United States economy is the strongest in the world and attracts the most talented people from all over the places and continue the innovation.
I think that's a very important argument. The United States is absolutely fortunate to have Silicon Valley. It has fueled some part of economic growth in the United States. And again, the fact that Silicon Valley has been a positive for the US economy doesn't mean that everything they do is right and then they should be completely unregulated. So my argument is that, of course, we should cherish the type of entrepreneurship that Silicon Valley needs. But I think it's very difficult for me to accept that if you had, for example, some amount of regulation on what Silicon Valley companies do, or some limits into how much monopoly they set up in their sectors, that you wouldn't get any of the innovation. In fact, our evidence from other eras is that more regulated, more competitive environments are even better for wages, for productivity. AT&T became dominant force and it was broken up. That did not hurt the telephony sector or the internet. In fact, it opened up the path to all of the online services, because under monopoly that would not have happened. Standard Oil, if it had continued, I think the energy sector would be in a much worse situation. So we can celebrate the innovation in Silicon Valley, but still say that no, we don't need another 100 people with $500 billion worth of wealth. And no, we don't actually need companies that are just focused on automation and creating disinformation, and some sort of more regulatory environment would be actually better for channeling that innovative energy.
Well, I'm a political scientist. I'm actually very much worried about the technology gave way too much power to some government. Like in the case of China, the advancement in technology gives too much power to the government, and they exercise their power onto their own people using like a surveillance system, etc. And I'm also concerned that if that becomes a successful story, then a lot of other authoritarian government will probably emulate the case of China.
The problem we're facing is not just one of automation and the excessive power of companies in labor markets. It's also one of excessive power of everybody who controls data. We have created an environment in which data has become very centralized. That was part of the nature of the current approach to AI, which is very data intensive. It was also a consequence of the unregulated structure in which online activities have grown, for example, individualized digital ads. And that sort of technology of data collection, data processing has then become a tool in the hands of the Chinese Communist Party and other authoritarian governments to control their people. But it has also become a tool in the hands of Facebook and Google to control their customers. So there is this centralization of information without any regulation. You see many different costs from it. I think I am very critical of Amazon, Google, Facebook, Microsoft, but I would still prefer them having my data than the Chinese Communist Party. And we are seeing actually the very corrosive effects of the Chinese Communist Party's growing control via data. Our take in the book is that Chinese state would not be able to have the same degree of control over demands from middle class, rising aspirations in China, from students, from the labor movement, and so on, without control of data. And so it's actually creating a boost for authoritarian regimes. And in fact, the Chinese technology is then being exported to other countries who are authoritarian and some even democratic, who then use the same sort of face recognition and other kind of control technologies in order to pacify their population. So it is a problem, but it's not going to be a solution to say, okay, we should get rid of the Chinese Communist Party and have Google control that information, because it's going to create the same sort of tension. And that's why what we call for in the book is that in the same way that we need to redirect technological change in the labor market to empower workers, we also need to regulate and redirect technological change in online communication to empower citizens against governments or against too large corporations.
Once I remember when the internet arrived, the political scientists and some of the economists as well, we thought it's going to be the game changer. From the perspective of political science, it will create a space for people to communicate and engage more and produce a collective power. But it seems like becoming more like a real word, even online. And also, as you pointed out, it is actually the place for the fake news and the disinformation. I know you're very much worried about that. In the book, you describe that. So what do you think is the solution for that?
Great question. The early hopes about online communication, social media, have all been dashed. People were inspired by protests in the Philippines or Tahrir Square uprising, where people use Facebook and Twitter. Now, were they naive in thinking that this would be a new phase of democracy? Yes and no. Yes, they were naive in the sense that they did not take into account the way in which authoritarian governments could use technology. But they weren't wrong that online communication, digital communication, and today AI have that potential. The pendulum has swung to the other end, and some people claim AI and internet are inherently authoritarian. I don't think that's right. I think those technologies are highly malleable and we can use them in different ways. And the Taiwan example is, again, a very important one because it shows how, with a very small amount of adjustment to the technical structure of these tools, you can turn them into very pro-democratic tools. So under the leadership of their digital minister, Audrey Tang, Taiwan has built many, many tools for greater participation of people into the democratic process, for them to regulate bureaucrats or government services, to even create their own services using government data, to be able to vote on various direct democracy initiatives, and also to prepare the types of tools that were immediately rolled out at the early stages of the COVID-19 pandemic. So you can see the same sort of aspiration in some startup companies in the United States. But right now, I would say, no, those companies don't have a chance because they are against trillion-dollar companies like Facebook and Apple and Twitter. And without some sort of regulatory structure to protect them, I don't think they're going to survive very well.
But some people probably say that if you put some regulation into this area, then it may violate, the freedom of speech and those,
Well, first of all, I think it would be a terrible idea for the government to decide what's right and what's wrong speech.
Right.
So most of the things that we call for are not like that. For example, we call for a digital ad tax. And the point of that is that the most pernicious uses of this data that we talked about that's been so vociferously collected is to turn them into individualized digital ads. And what that does is it makes it very difficult for alternative platforms like the pro-democratic ones that I mentioned, to emerge. So one way to deal with that is to create more competitive room by taxing negative externality way in which people are monetizing it. And that then creates more room for platforms like Wikipedia. The second one is without the government sort of deciding what's right and what's wrong, we could still relax the very extreme Section 230 regulations that say that as a newspaper, you have a huge amount of responsibility in what you print and you can be sued and be bankrupt. And then to Twitter and Facebook, we give complete immunity, even though they are much, much more powerful, much, much, much richer companies. And they can print anything and they can promote anything. And they make a lot of money from extremely inflammatory content. The idea that we propose is that, sure, if something is posted on Facebook, Facebook should not have editorial responsibility on that one, except in extreme cases, child pornography, etc., for which they do a But if they are promoting content and making a lot of money from digital ads on the basis of that, then they should have the same sort of editorial responsibility for that as the New York Times or Washington Post does. And that, again, does not require the government to be the arbiter of truth.
Because, a lot of people are now getting their news and stories from the newsfeed of those SNS platforms. So it's becoming more and more important. It's not just the sharing their ideas. It's more like the source of the news and the information. So you think they should bear more responsibility for that.
Absolutely.
So for the solution in the book, you will actually propose three or more, but just can summarize the three. Like first, to change the narrative that the technology equals progress, because it doesn't necessarily go that way. And the second, foster countervailing powers such as the civil organization. And the third, you have to establish good institution or government policy that can profit broader public, not just a small segment population or the businesses. Which one do you want to emphasize most?
Well, it's a hierarchy. We have to start with the change in narrative. We have to have a clear set of aspirations. I would say 50% of the battle is won if, as a society in South Korea, in the United States, in Europe, we agree that technology's future is important, but it has to go in a more pro-human direction, complementing humans, empowering workers and citizens. Once we agree on that, it's feasible and it's desirable, I think more than 50% of the battle is won. But to turn that into a reality, that's when you need countervailing powers, new institutions. When we talk about AI, it has critical implications for workers. Where is the worker voice? Sam Altman and Mark Zuckerberg and senators can debate the future of generative AI, but what about millions of workers who are going to be affected? So they need to have a voice, and it's not going to be the traditional unions. So you need a sort of a new labor movement, civil society organizations. Many of those things endogenously emerged at the time when there was imbalance of power. So we need sort of new organizations to emerge. And then the policies, we've talked about some of them, like digital ad taxes or creating the right sort of editorial responsibility. But another one, let me add, we have to treat labor and capital more symmetrically. I think both politically and economically, we have come to treat capital much more favorably. In the United States, for example, capital is not taxed. Labor is taxed heavily. Capital gets all of the benefits of subsidies and so on, and labor doesn't. So a tax system and also international treaties about taxation of capital and movement of capital that make sure that firms don't have artificial incentives to automate work and shift away from labor, I think would be welcome.
One last thing, could you please have a word for Korean readers? Because there's a lot of fans of yours since you published the Why Nations Fail.
Well, I am really delighted about the interest that both of my previous two books, Why Nations Fail and The Narrow Corridor, generated in Korea. And I've also tremendously enjoyed visiting the country in the past. So I hope Korean readers will also enjoy this new book. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Esemoglu.
Thank you very much. And it's great seeing you after 2 decades.
Okay, great. Thank you. Bye-bye.